What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this tutorial we are going to learn how to do something like this. So as you saw, we set up a 3D track to this cinematic with some nice floating rocks, a nice 3D logo with multiple extrusions and materials on it, and as well as some shadows and some other things to make it fit into the environment better. So the first thing you're going to need to do is find a cinematic. So in this case, I made a nice, very simple cinematic, just pretty much a panorama of the street here in Paradise Palms. I will leave it in the description below if you want to follow along exactly with this tutorial. So once you get this cinematic, just drag it into a composition in After Effects. And the first thing you want to do is click on it. And then in the right side panel here, you will see something called Tracker. Once you go to the Tracker, there'll be an option to track camera. I'm just going to press that and it's going to track the camera on the scene. For the sake of the tutorial, I pre-tracked it. So ours already finished analyzing. And once it's done analyzing, it'll come up with a bunch of points here. As you see, there's some on the street, there's some on the grass, there's some on the building, there's some on the rocks. But we got to find some points that will align to where we want our logo to align. So in this case, we want our logo to be floating somewhere in the middle of the street. So we're going to want it to be somewhere around here. So I'm just clicking and dragging on the actual cinematic here around these points, and then it created a nice little target area there. So once we have our point selected, we're just going to right click on this target and select create a null and a camera. So this null, if we press P on our keyboard, we see all the positions of this null, and this is pretty much just going to be our guiding position to where we want our 3D elements to be. So as we see when we scrub through the scene, that null is sticking to that one position on the street. So now that we have the null, the next thing we got to do is find the logo. So it depends what logo you're using. In this case, we are going to be using this logo here. It is Fluid GG's logo, which I personally like. So this logo right here. But for this particular PNG, we don't really want to use the outer two, the white and the dark blue here. We also want to use the two Fs here, the light blue, and then the diamond shape here. So in order to make this 3D, we're going to have to make a path for each of the elements in this logo. So to do that, what we're going to do is right click, new solid, or easier way, Control Y to create a new solid, and we'll name this one logo base path. So now we just have this solid blocking the screen, so we can just hide this solid for now, and then we'll go up to our pen tool. And what we'll start doing is we will start tracing the base of our logo. So we can trace the two Fs and the diamond here. So just a very rough trace. For the sake of the tutorial, I've already traced something, but I'll still go through the steps to show you what you want to do. You're just going to take the pen tool, and when as you're selected onto the solid, you're just going to literally make this path around where you want your logo to be extruded. So in this case, we got the two Fs here, and then we also got this diamond over here. So now once we're done making a path for each of those Fs, we also see there's some decals and some more details in the actual logo. We have these little decals here on the F, and then also we have this little diamond decal up there in the diamond. So in order to also make those in our element 3D, to make them also pop out from the base, the logo base of the two Fs and the diamonds, we're going to create some more solids. So we can create a new solid here. We'll call this one logo decal 1, and we can hide this layer, go up to our pen tool again, and now we'll click on our pen tool and we'll start tracing the first decal here, the little decal inside of this left F here. And we're going to want to do this one for every single decal. So in this particular one, we have 3 decals, and I'm just doing a very rough trace since I've already pre-traced this logo. So you can do it as detailed or as sloppy as you want. So now that we got the first decal, we're going to do the same process and create a new solid. We'll call this one logo decal 2, and we can hide it, and we can go to our pen tool and do it on the right side now. And once we're done with that, lastly, we can create one more for that little diamond one. We'll call this logo decal 3, and we can hide that. And we can trace this little diamond right here. So now, once you have all of these paths here, and for the sake of the tutorial, I've already traced this a little bit cleaner. It's still pretty choppy, but we're going to use these paths instead of the ones that I was just using as an example. So we'll just drag those paths in there, and we can even hide all of these and the logo. And now we can start creating our element 3D once we have all of our paths created. So to do that, we're going to create yet another solid. We'll call this one E3D or element 3D. Then we'll go up to our effects and presets and type in element, and then we'll put element 3D onto this layer. Element 3D is a plugin that you can get for After Effects, and it is one of my all-time favorite plugins. You can do so much with this one plugin. And as we see here, we have a bunch of different options here. The first thing we're going to go to is custom layers, and then we'll go to custom text and masks. So as we see here, we have a bunch of options for path layers, up to 15. And usually you might be used to, if you've worked with Element 3D before, you might be used to just putting in one path layer as the text and just being done with it. But this time we're going to create 4 different path layers for each of these paths that we made. So to do that, we'll set the path layer 1 to the logo base. We'll set the path layer 2 to the first decal. We'll set the path layer 3 to the second, path layer 4 to the third. And then where it says source, we're going to change where it says source to masks right here. So change all those to masks. And then we can start hopping right into Element 3D by clicking Scene Setup. And here we will just click Extrude, and then automatically it'll extrude our 3D logo here, the base of the path layer 1, which we set it to. And we can mess around with the extrusion settings here. We can set the bevel scale to be a little bit higher, maybe somewhere around 9, like that. That looks pretty good. And then once we have that, we'll focus on the material a little bit later. We will, where it says extrusion model, we'll right click that and we'll just select duplicate all. And here we have a second extrusion model. Now, where it says extrusion, the first option here, where it says custom path 1, we're going to change that to custom path 2. And now you see that little F decal that we traced earlier, and we will set the Z position, the Z offset a little bit better, and we will just drag that to where we want it to be on the left side here. So somewhere around there looks good. We can maybe put it a little bit less. And then we can even mess with the extrusion settings of this decal here. If we wanted to, we can go into the material here and go where it says bevel curve. We can set that to 0 to make a more chiseled look, as you can see there. We can set the bevel size to something more, maybe like 1 even, or 0.9. And that'll just create a more chiseled kind of look that I personally like, but it is all up to you. Maybe we can expand the edges a little bit less, and we will have something that looks like that. Once we have that, we will do it again. We'll right click that extrusion model and say duplicate all, and we'll set the custom path here to custom path 3. And now if we move it over the x-axis, you can see it is flipped. It is not flipped around like it's supposed to be. An easy fix to that is if we just go down to transform over here, we can just flip the x and boom, it is just like that. And now we're just gonna fix the x-axis here. We don't need to fix the y or the z one. And that looks pretty good there. And then lastly, we're gonna do it one last time, right click, duplicate all, and then we'll go into the extrusion and make this custom path be custom path 4, and that will be our diamond. So we'll set X and Y up to the correct position of this diamond here, and something just about like that. And then we pretty much have our logo here. Now we just have to add some materials. So if we go down here over to presets, now we have a bunch of different materials to choose from. There's the default ones that come with Element 3D that you have, but I'm personally a fan of these Pro Shaders packs. If you don't already, there's a bunch of packs you can get for Element 3D, a bunch of materials that you can download for free for the Element 3D plugin. And a lot of these look really cool, like the metal black drips. I think this one will look pretty good with our scene. And then we can set for the decals, we can set a different material for it. Maybe something like a gold kind of popping highlight. I'm personally a fan of like gold touches and stuff like that. So the gold grunge looks pretty nice, and we'll set the gold grunge for each of our materials. And that looks pretty clean. So once we have that, that's pretty much all we need to do for the logo. We can also go over here to environment and set the environment to something like this town here. And that will just make it look a little bit more realistic to our personal environment, because we are using something like a town. So something like that looks pretty good. Now, once we're done with that, we're also going to do the 3D rocks in this same Element 3D layer. So to do that, all we're going to do is we can close this group folder. Then we can go to Starter Pack Physical under Model Browser. And this is something that comes with Element 3D, so you don't have to download anything. And you scroll down and you see a bunch of these rocks. So if you just double click it and bring it into your scene, it'll automatically go under the group folder. But what we need to do is we need to drag these rocks outside of the group folder into their own group. So we have one rock there. We can do the second rock and we can do the third rock just for diversity and make it look a little bit more realistic, since obviously every rock is not the same. And as you see here, there's the number 1. That stands for the group folder that it's in. And we don't want it to be in the same group folder as our logo. So we want to set this to group folder 2 for all of these rocks. So now we got some rocks here and we got our 3D logo. So that's all we need to do. We can just press OK. And automatically our 3D logo pops up into the space here. And here we got to set it to where we want it to be in the scene. So to do that, we'll go to group 1, we'll go to particle replicator, and this is where our track null comes in. So if we press P on our keyboard, this track null will be our guide to where we want this 3D to be. So all we have to do is copy the X position of the track null, Command C, Command V, into the X position of the group 1 position. So we'll just do that to every position, Command C, Command V, and then the Z position, Command C, Command V as well. So now we have our logo where we want it to be in the environment. But then we can also we can mess with the position X and Y to make it look like it's floating up in the air. And somewhere around there. And then also, I don't recommend playing around too much with the position Z, because if we play too much around with the position Z, then it won't look like it's tracked to where we want it to be tracked. See how right now it looks like it's tracked to that one point in the street, and we want to keep it looking like that. And if we mess around with it too much, it will kind of lose its positioning on there. But if we want to make it bigger, we can go down to particle look, and we can adjust the particle size here. So we can make it a little bit bigger, just like that. And we can just keep adjusting with these settings here. We can also go down to rotation, and we can adjust this Y rotation here. And this is actually a setting that we can animate. So if we go into the very start of our scene, and we can click the stopwatch on Y rotation, we can set this to something like 55. And then we go all the way to the end, and we can set it to something like 11 or 9 or something like that. And that will look pretty good. It'll just add some movement to our 3D logo. You can also change the Z rotation a little bit, because it does look a little bit crooked. So something like -2 maybe will make it look a little bit better. And then we pretty much have it where we want to have it nice in the scene there. So now we've positioned our logo. But now we're going to go into the rocks. And to do that, we're going to go into group 2, because remember we set them to be in group 2. And we'll click down particle replicator, and where it says particle count, the first setting here, we're going to up that up to something around 50 to 100. You can do as many or as little rocks as you want. I'll do somewhere around 70. But it just depends how many rocks you want in your scene. And then we're going to change the replicator shape from point to plane. And automatically we can see all these rocks kind of showing up. So in order to spread them out and make them look like they're floating around our logo, we're going to have to mess with the X scale and the Z scale and some scatter options. So over here where it says X scale, we can up that up. And then the Z scale, we can also up that up. So this will look like they're all the way out in they're all the way separated out in Z space. And then we can go down to some more options here. If you scroll down, we see some scatter options, and the Y scale doesn't do anything, so don't even bother with that. But the scatter here, this is something that we can animate also to make the rocks have more life. But first we're gonna mess with the X scatter. As you can see, their rocks are kind of getting like misplaced and scattered around. It just makes it a little bit more realistic. And then we can change the Y scatter as well to however we want it, something like that. And then the Z scatter as well. So we're just scattering all these guys around in the environment. And another thing we can do is if we go to particle look, we can set the particle size to a little bit less maybe. And also we have a particle size random percentage. And if we up that, you can see some rocks now become bigger than others, which is good because it makes it more realistic, obviously, because rocks are, well, always different in size. So that just makes it a little bit more realistic. And then we can also scroll down here to where it says particle rotation. And we have a rotation random here. As you see, that just rotates our rocks randomly. So more diversity in our rocks, which is good. This is another thing we can keyframe to make them animate and have a little bit more life. And if you want, you can mess with the X rotation. There's not really that much of a need to mess with it when you have the rotation random, in my opinion, but you can do whatever you want there. And then we pretty much have our rock set up. So let's add some keyframes like we did to the rotation of the logo. We'll go to the very start of it and we'll keyframe the rotation random and also the scatter. And we'll scatter it out maybe like 15. And then we'll go to the very end and we can scatter even more, maybe like 25. And then we can make it rotate about twice. So now, as you see, the rocks have a little bit more movement into them. And now one last thing we have to do is in the position, we have to position them to the Z space that the logo is in. So the logo position is like 3000 Z in the Z space. So we can adjust that. And now this will track along with our logo as well. And we can mess with some other position settings of our rocks as well. So now as you see these rocks, and if I just bring it up a little bit more, I think it looks better. Now as you see, these rocks have a little bit more movement and they're just floating around our logo, which I think looks really cool. So once we're done with that, we're going to have to add some shadows and some lights and stuff like that to make it look like it's more in the environment. So to do that, we're going to have to go back into Element 3D, go back to Scene Setup, and over here, we're going to create a new plane right here. So that'll make this little white thing. We're going to just have to scale that up pretty big, as big as you want. And then we'll bring it down to where the floor pretty much is in our scene. And then if we go down to the material here and scroll all the way down to where we see matte shadow, we're going to turn that on and then we'll press OK. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create some lights. So if we now what we're going to do is we're going to create some shadows. So if we scroll down over here, go into render settings and then go into shadows and make sure it's on ray traced here. You're going to click enable. And now when we create a new light, we'll create a new light and we'll say it's a point light and make sure it does cast shadows. you can see some shadows coming in. So obviously we're gonna have to adjust this light so the shadows don't look like this. And it all really depends on where the light is. So you can see here, if we move it around to where the sun is, so up here and something like that. And then if we press P on our keyboard, we can also adjust all these positions. So we're gonna have to adjust a lot of these positions here and make it so these shadows line up to where we want them in the scene. So right here, and then this shadow we can see is our shadow of the logo, so that's good. And we kind of want to match it with how the shadow of this pole looks. So it kind of looks like it's going like over here, sort of. So that looks good. Now, as you see, the shadow looks really, really dark and very pixelated. We can fix that by going to light options here and adjusting these pixels. So if we do something like that and then turn down the darkness by a lot, then we can see just these slight shadows coming in. And we can still adjust these pixels. And we can also, if we go into Element 3D and go back to our ray traced shadows here, we can turn up the sampling and make it a little bit higher quality as well. So a little something like that should work for our shadows. And now you see we have the shadows of the rocks and we have the shadow of the logo, which looks really nice in our scene. And now we're just gonna have to create some more lights. We'll create a point light. And for these lights, we're not gonna cast shadows. We just want it to just light up our actual rock. So as we see, if we bring up the positioning here, we can kind of position it to where we want it to be. And you can spend as much time as you want kind of adjusting these lights and putting them where you want them in the scene. And so let's try to light up this logo a little bit here. So let's have to adjust it to where we want it. And there we see some light now coming onto the logo there, which is nice. And that looks pretty good. And we can even duplicate it. Press P on our keyboard. And sometimes what I like doing is then adjusting the Z scale a little bit. Maybe adjusting it the other way. And then going down into intensity and just turning the intensity down. And it just adds a little bit more vibrance. And what we can also do is a cool trick. If we want to make it look like it's kind of reflecting off the sky, we can add like a nice sky blue light here. Maybe that's a little bit too dark. Maybe something like that. Or we can even use this to pick it, something like that. And press P on our keyboard and just set this up as another light for our scene as well. And then if we go into this side, we can kind of see that there isn't any light. So we can duplicate this light again and try to bring a light onto this side. And here we just made a light that's going to light up kind of the side of this logo here now. And we can add another one. And now it's time to set up some more compositing things to make it look more realistic. And as you probably saw, as we added more lights, the light of the first light that we have the cast shadows on is barely seeable. So to fix that, just bring up the darkness again. And now we will be able to see that once again. And you can bring up this fusion how much you want. And once again, just play with these settings as much as you want. So now we got the shadows and we got the lights set up. Next thing we got to do is also, if we go down to render settings, some little tweaks we can do is if we go over here to lighting and set the lighting from none to dramatic, that'll just make it a little bit more bright and vibrant, which I personally like. Then we'll also go down to ambient occlusion. And this is a very important step. If we turn on ambient occlusion, automatically you see some shadows happening. And if we turn up the intensity, not that much, maybe somewhere around like 20, then you can see all these shadows now coming in, and you can see the extrusions now have a shadow on the base of it. So here's without it, and now here's with it, and just makes it look a lot more realistic and stuff like that. So that's definitely good to have. Now what we can do is if we add some more effects to it, such as a fast box blur. This is something I like to add to a lot of my 3D stuff, just makes it look a little bit more realistic. Set this to very low, like a 0.3, maybe 2 iterations. And then you can see the tiny bit of difference it makes, maybe like 1.5 iterations. And thank you, After Effects, for saving it. Then you can see like the tiny difference it makes. It just kind of makes it so it's a little bit out of focus, so it looks a tiny bit more realistic. And then if you go into curves, you can also mess with the curves of it a little bit. So if you want it to be a little bit darker, we can mess with that a little bit by just turning the curves down like that. Looks pretty good. Just however you want it to be. So something just like, oh, not that, definitely not that. Something like that. And you can mess around with the other colors, but for this tutorial, we'll just keep going. You can also add some photo filter, and this can make it look more in your environment, just like a warming filter like this. There's a bunch of presets you can choose from. That first warming filter is pretty good, and you can see how just much of a tiny difference that makes, but it does make it look a little bit more inside of our environment. And now once we've done that, we are pretty much done with this tutorial. We got the shadows, we got the lights, and we got pretty much everything. The rocks revolving or floating around the logo, and as always, you can add your own CC and black bars to make it look even better. So if we add in our own CC here, just like that, it makes it look a little bit darker. This is just a CC I made earlier. And then maybe if we want to add some cinema bars here as well, and then set the scaling to something like 85. And there we go. Now it looks like a very realistic 3D scene with the rocks revolving around our logo. So that's pretty much all for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed. There's a lot of different steps and different things you could do with Element 3D. And there's even more things that you can do to this scene to make it look even more realistic if you do so choose. But that's it for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like, make sure to comment, make sure to subscribe for a bunch more of these tutorials. And let me know down in the comment section below what other tutorials you would like to see on this channel, what other Fortnite editor tutorials you would like to know. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.